All right, hi everybody. Please join me in welcoming Tim Button, who has come here to tell us about his work on sets. Tim is a professor of philosophy philosophy and logic at the University College London, where he works on the intersection of philosophy, logic, and mathematics. So welcome, and thanks for coming here, Tim.
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's great to have been invited. So my talk is given a slightly whimsical title. It's 20 Contemplations on the Iterative Hierarchy, and it's based a little bit on a Messiaen piano work that you may know called 20 Contemplations of the Infant Jesus. The idea is, in the Messiaen thing, that there's a sort of infinite manner of ways in which you may end up reflecting upon Jesus. And so similarly here, I want to give you a sense that there's an infinite number of ways you might think about the iterative hierarchy. So the way in which I'm going to explain that is, here's the structure. I'm going to start by telling you some stuff which hopefully is relatively familiar. So it's the standard way of thinking about the iterative hierarchy. So I'll remind you of what that is, and I'll give a particular way of axiomatizing it, which I call level theory. Then I'm going to give a different way of thinking about the iterative hierarchy, which changes things around a bit. And then I'm going to give you another way, which changes things around even more. And then I'm going to offer a general template for generating new ways of just mashing things around and telling a new story about something which is recognizably an iterative hierarchy. But what's distinctive about all of these different ways of smashing things around, all of these different ways of taking a different perspective on the iterative hierarchy, is that they're all formally equivalent in a sense which I can make perfectly precise, and I will make perfectly precise. And this leads to a kind of speculation. Are these all just different ways of looking at the same thing, or are they fundamentally different ways of thinking about things? And I want to say they're all just different ways of looking at the same thing. And having claimed that, I'll try and derive some general metaphysical conclusions about how to think about the iterative hierarchy. Just before I get going, I need to apologize for a slight misselling thing I did in the abstract. I said I was going to talk about a potentialist way of thinking about the hierarchy. But when I actually sat down to write the slides, I realized it was just going to take up way too much time. Even with an hour to talk through, I would completely run out of time if I tried to do that. So I'm happy to comment on that in the Q&A and everything, but I won't go through that in the main, like my main talk, because otherwise you'll be here. Well, I'll be here all night, and you'll be here well into your late afternoon and early evening. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to get started with the basic story. So hopefully this is familiar. The basic story about the iterative hierarchy of sets goes as follows. So here's my little short version. Sets are arranged in stages. Every set is found at some stage. And at any stage S, for any sets you found before that stage, you find a set whose members are exactly those sets. You find nothing else at that stage. Okay, so this should be pretty familiar if you've read Boulos's paper on the iterative conception of set. Boulos was by no means, though, the first to get there. He starts his paper by saying, this is familiar to mathematicians. I think what he meant is he'd gone to a talk by Dana Scott, in which Dana Scott presented things this way. And Scott and Montague had done prior work explaining things this way. And everything that I'm going to do in this section of the talk is very heavily indebted to Scott and Montague, and also in ways that I'll come to later, Derek and Potter. Now, one of the things about the way I've told this story is that it's extremely minimal. So you may be familiar with this, but you'll notice that I haven't said anything about the height of the hierarchy. I've just said that there are stages, but I haven't given you any real indication of how many stages there are or how long this process runs for. And apparently I've said nothing about the order type of the stages. So for everything I've said so far, you might think, well, maybe there's no first stage, that stages have always been going, that they're infinitely backwards in time or something like that. Maybe between every stage, there's another stage. You don't know at this point. In fact, it will turn out you don't need to say any of those things explicitly. You get answers for them just from the very basic story that I've told, which is kind of nice. It says there's very little choice in how to set things up. Once you've accepted this basic story, a lot flows from it. So this is a basic story. Why accept it? well, it's a nice story in all sorts of ways, and I like nice stories. It also seems to be straightforwardly coherent. Like, ever since we started talking about sets and we had Russell's paradox, we've realized that naive reasoning about sets is going to lead us to trouble. This story seems straightforwardly coherent. There's not going to be any trouble lurking there, so that's nice. I can say more about that later, but for now, we're just going to run with this story. Okay, so at the moment, it is just a story. It's just perfectly informal, so let's make it a bit more formal. The first way I'm going to suggest that we might make it more formal is by axiomatizing it, but helping ourselves to as many primitive devices as we need to tell us what's happening. So this is going to be sort of replete with different primitives, but it's going to be clearly and obviously true given everything we said in the basic story. So we're going to use a two-typed theory, so it's going to be first and second order. You could do this all in a first order way, and then you'd need schemes instead of a second order principle in a way which is obvious. I kind of like second order logic, but if you hate it, don't worry, you can just replace everything I say about second order stuff using first order schemes. And I'm going to have two different first order sorts for sets, which I write in an italic font, and for stages, which I write in a bold font. Because after all, the story talked about both stages and sets, because sets are found at stages. So we'll just have two primitive first order sorts for those different kinds of entities. And then we're just going to have 5 axioms based on the story that I gave. So the first axiom isn't in the story. The first axiom is the axiom of extensionality in a totally familiar form. Sets are identical just in case they have the same members. Now, it wasn't part of the story, but I take it it's meant to be something like analytic of sets. So we can add it to the story if we like, or we can just say, well, we were talking about sets, so obviously they're extensional. The next axiom also isn't explicit in the story, but I take it it's implicit. So I'm talking about stages here because I'm using a bold font. So I'm saying for any stages R, S, and T, and then I'm using an order relation between them, and that's going to be a relation of before. So this basically tells you that before is a transitive relation. And again, I take it that that's analytic. If before isn't transitive, you're not actually talking about beforeness. So again, we could make that explicit in the story. We were talking about stages coming before each other's. We could add a little reminder that says, oh, by the way, before is transitive. But I take it we don't need to bother. The next principle tells you that for any set, because we use an italic font, there is a stage, because a bold font, such that, and then I've introduced a new primitive here, the set is found at that stage. Well, that's immediate from the story, because I told you sets are found at stages. That's the only way in which you ever find sets. So that's good. The next principle is a principle of priority, and it tells you for any stage and for any set found at that stage, every member of that stage, and then I need a new thing here, any member of that set was found at an earlier stage. So this thing here, I should probably have written it out in full. Oop. The bit where I said X sort of curly precedes stage S should be taken as there is some stage which comes before S such that X is found at that stage. And then it's immediate from the story if you just think it through, because you only ever find a set when you've already found all its members. So for any set, if you find it at a stage, you must have found its members earlier. And then there's a second order principle, a principle of specification, which is kind of like a separation principle, which goes like this. For any property F and for any stage S, if all the Fs are found before that stage S, then at that stage, you find the set of all the Fs. So again, that's fine given the story as I told it, because I said, for any things that you found earlier, at that stage, you find the set of them. So this is just a way of making that formal. And there we go. Those are the 5 axioms. Now, hopefully I've said enough to make it clear that this theory of 5 axioms is going to be true once you've accepted the basic story. The problem with the theory is that it's clunky. It's got lots of primitives. It's got 2 sorts. So it would be nice to get rid of it. Now, you might think that's just a kind of, oh, wouldn't it be nice to tidy this up? I think there's actually more to it than that. I think you don't want to have to talk about sets and stages, given various reasons you might have for being interested in set theory. In particular, if you want mathematics all to be based in sets, you won't want to have to talk about stages as well. So it'd be nice to be able to get rid of them. And you can. And here's how you do it. You offer a theory which I call level theory, which has 3 axioms. The axiom of extensionality, which is perfectly familiar. Sets are identical just in case they have the same members. An axiom of separation, second order version here, but you could give the first order scheme if you'd prefer, that for any set, there is a set of members of that set which have whatever property you liked. And then a final axiom, which is for any set, there is an S, which is a superset of it, and which is a level. Now, obviously, I've said I want to get rid of all the primitives except set membership, and I've just used this phrase is a level, written L-E-V. So I need to have an explicit definition of that rather than take it as a primitive, which is given just in terms of membership. And the definition is rather clever. I can say that because although it's my definition, I built it on the work of other people who are much smarter than me. So by giving credit to them, I can say it's a jolly clever definition, but it isn't quite what any of them say. I'm not going to go through how the definition works because in some sense, it's more illuminating. The existence of such a definition is more illuminating than its details, but I can go through the details if you want in the Q&A. The basic idea is that levels go proxy for stages. So they just collect together all the stuff that intuitively came before. Very roughly, subsethood is what you end up with as the notion of is found at. And the ordering that you had on the stages is just membership, and then everything works out just fine. And you can make that thought more precise if we look at some results about this theory that I've just laid down. So the first result is that stage theory, so that was the theory which was obviously true, which had all the primitives, proves a sentence just in case level theory proves that same sentence, where that sentence is formulated in the language of level theory. I've actually put that in terms of formulas rather than sentences, and that's fine. Okay, so I didn't put a typo on the slide there. This basically tells you that level theory is just what you get from stage theory when you stop talking about stages, when you strip out that stuff and realize that it's redundant. So level theory is perfectly sound of anything which obeys the ordinary story that I started off with, because stage theory is. It's just not bothering to tell you about the stages. So it's a stripped down version. So that's nice. You know that because stage theory was true of anything that obeys the basic story that I started with, level theory must be as well. The second main theorem is a theorem that you prove within level theory itself. And this is the theorem that the levels are well ordered by membership. You might think of that as the fundamental theorem here. Now that's nice because it turns out then that stages are well founded. If I go back to the story, I didn't seem to specify anything about that. I didn't give you any indication that the stages were well-founded. I said you might wonder whether there is a first stage, whether they went on forever before the moment that we're at, or whether between any two stages there is another stage, whether they're dense. But we now know that can't be the case. Stages are well-founded and levels are well-ordered. And the third main result, this is a result which in some sense needs second-order logic, is that if you look at full second-order logic, then your models of this second-order level theory are exactly the V alphas as standard ZF characterizes them. So that was why Montague and Scott were first interested in theories like this, because they were looking for something which gave you a way of characterizing each V alpha, just a theory like that on its own. So that's very nice. But it's also nice that it falls out without actually explicitly having to build it that way. We didn't just say, let's look for a theory which does exactly that. We told a story and we got well-foundedness out for free. And then we got this quasi-categoricity result for free. So that's very nice. It shows us that if we start out with this basic story, there's very little flexibility in what happens later. Indeed, if you're willing to accept full second-order logic, Theorem 1.3 tells you that the only flexibility that you have is tell me what alpha is. tell me how long the sequence of stages goes. And that's the only parameter you can play with. Everything else is dictated by the story. And that's surprising, given the story is literally, 3 sentences long, apparently says very little, turns out to say an incredible amount. And remember that the story is nice because it's coherent. So hooray, very little choice in how we set up the hierarchy. And then just a final thing, to make all of this stuff more familiar to those of you that learned set theory in a more usual way. The familiar theory ZF, or ZF if you're American, and I get confused as to which of them I'm meant to say, is identical to the theory that I've laid down, level theory, if you add a couple of extra axioms, infinity and replacement. So that's nice. We can now set this in a more familiar setting. But this gives us a new way to think about like what justifies the axioms of ZF. You say, well, tell the story that justifies the axioms of level theory, and then tell me a little bit extra about infinity and replacement. And those basically just amount to claims of the form. The hierarchy is relatively tall. So there you go. That's how you justify ZF. Okay, so that's good. Hopefully that's familiar, at least in part. The story that I started with is hopefully familiar. ZF is probably familiar. The other bits mightn't be entirely familiar, but it's, you know, a nice way to think about the cumulative hierarchy. Perhaps a slightly nicer way than is standardly taught, because everything just flows a bit more naturally. In fact, if I can just say one thing, the result that if you start with ZF, then you can arrange everything into your V alphas is quite a substantial result. Like, it actually takes quite a lot of work to get to. The result that I call level, theorem 1.2 there on the slides, that the levels are well ordered by membership, it takes about a side from the definitions. So the definitions are a bit weird. I have to agree that the definitions are not immediately obvious, but this is a surprisingly simple result. So there's, you know, just something on a technical level to be said for it. But let me move on, because my aim is not to proselytize level theory in particular, but to use this very weak theory in some sense, because, you know, it's got a model in V1, so like incredibly tiny little stuff. I'm going to use this theory as a springboard to giving you some other stories. Because I said there's very little choice in how you set up the hierarchy, but there are alternative ways to describe a hierarchy. What we're going to need to do is vary the story, and that will give us some different theories. So, second section of the talk, I'm going to play with the story a little bit and give you a different way of thinking about sets, a different cumulative hierarchy, a different formal theory, and then I'm going to explain how it relates to the first. Oh, I should have said earlier, if anyone wants to like jump in with questions, like just, you know, not big philosophical ones, but just, I don't understand what you've written, or is there a typo, or could you just repeat that? Please feel free. I'll try and keep an eye on things. I can only actually see 5 of your faces at any given moment or something, but, you know, if you want to raise a hand or something, do that. Okay, so second section, the complemented story. So I'm going to tell a slightly different story, and it goes like this. Sets are arranged in stages. Every set is found at some stage. At any stage S, for any sets found before that stage, we find both a set whose members are exactly those sets that we're talking about, and also a set whose non-members are exactly those sets. And we find nothing else at stage S. Okay, so hopefully you can see this is just the ordinary story with some extra bits in red. That's how I've tried to format it. I hope it's coming through as with sufficient like resolution that it's red. So the low clause there is the only clause that I had before, but then I've given you this extra high clause. And this has the effect that whenever you find a set, you also find its absolute complement using whichever the clauses you use to find the original set. So just as an illustration, assuming there is a first stage, at the very first stage, you'll find the empty set using the low clause, because you find the set of anything that you found before. There's nothing that comes before because we're talking about the very first stage. So you'll find the empty set immediately. And then you'll also find a set whose non-members are exactly the things you found earlier. Well, there's nothing you found earlier. So this set has no non-members, which is to say this set contains everything. So it's the universal set. And I do mean everything there, I mean, absolutely everything that you will ever find or not find, just all the stuff. Okay, so these are absolute complements. It's not relative complements. You start out by finding the empty set and the universal set. At the next stage, you'll find a singleton of the empty set, a singleton of the universal set, a doubleton which has both the empty set and the universal set as members, a set which omits only the empty set and the universal set, etc. Again, though, we've made this choice about finding complements as we go, but otherwise it's a very minimal story. It's minimal in exactly the same ways that the ordinary story was minimal, because I got to this story just by taking the ordinary story and adding a little bit in red. And actually, just credit where it's due, this is a very minimal version of a story that Thomas Forster tells as a way of making sense of some stuff that Alonzo Church did. I'll come back to Church a little bit later, I think, if I have time. Okay, so this is a different conception of set, because on this conception of set, every set has an absolute complement, whereas on the ordinary story, no set has an absolute complement. So they're clearly somewhat different notions of set. But what happens when we try to axiomatize this story? Oh, that is a slide I don't need. So I'll say, once again, we can axiomatize things using tons of primitives, and that will be our first way of doing it. So we're going to follow exactly the same sort of schematic template as we followed for the ordinary story. So we have all the primitives we need, and we have second order logic. We've got two different sorts for sets and stages. And we're also going to need two extra primitives here for talking about low sets, that is, sets that you find using the low clause, and high sets, that is, sets that you find using the high clause. Okay, so what axioms do we need? Well, the first few axioms are exactly the same as before, which are extensionality, sets are identical just in case they have the same members, order, which is the order relation is transitive, and staging, which was the principle that every set is found at some stage. And then we need three more axioms. The first axiom I call cases, and that tells you that every set is either low or it's high. And that's immediate from the story, because I say the only way to get a set is by finding it at a stage, and the only things you ever find, you find using either the low clause or the high clause. So clearly, every set has got to either be low or high. Notice, though, that this isn't an exclusive disjunction. For all we've said at the outset, maybe you find a set using both of these clauses. We'll have to check that later. There's also a principle of priority, which is a lot like the principle of priority that we had for the original plain version of stage theory, but it's slightly tweaked. So for any stage and any set found at that stage, if the set is low, i.e. it's found using the low clause, then all its members were found before that stage. That's no surprise, because the low clause is basically just the clause that we had before. But then we also have a condition for high sets, which is if you find the set A at a stage S and it's high, then all its non-members were found before that stage. And again, that's exactly what you would expect, because a high set is one which omits stuff, basically, and a low set is one which contains stuff. That's a way of thinking about it. And then exactly similar principles for the specification axiom. So long as all the Fs are found before a stage, you'll find the set of all the Fs at that stage, and it will be low, and you'll find the set of all non-Fs at that stage, and it'll be high. So basically just applying the same sort of reasoning. So these 6 axioms are, if you think about it for a couple of minutes, it's a bit brutal to ask you to do this on the fly while taking them in and I'm talking through them. But I promise you, if you think about this for just 2 or 3 minutes, looking at the story, looking at these axioms, reminding yourself what these primitives are meant to mean, these axioms are going to be obviously true of the complemented story. Again, though, it's a slightly clunky theory because it's got all these primitives. So we want to get rid of them, and we do basically the same thing as before. It turns out that we can get rid of all the primitives and just end up with a theory whose only primitive is the membership sign, and it just has 4 axioms. Extensionality, then a principle of complementation, which is that for any set, there is a set which is its complements, i.e. things are a member of A if and only if they're not a member of C. That's what the overlining there indicates. That notation was a couple of slides earlier, but you may have forgotten it. And moreover, a set is non-self-membered just in case its complement is self-membered. I mean, I don't know whether or not that sounds reasonable given the story, but I'm just going to lay down these axioms. I can lay down a principle of separation, which tells you that for any property and any non-self-membered set, there is a non-self-membered set, which is basically what you'd expect to get from separation. And then a principle which is a lot like the principle of stratification that I had as an axiom for level theory. So that said, any set is a subset of some level. This says any non-self-membered set is a subset of some bevel, which is a Boolean level. And you offer a similar sort of definition of these things as we did for levels earlier. I have to confess, if the definition of level looked hideous and ugly at first glance, the definition of what a Boolean level or bevel is wretched at first glance. And there's no way of making sense of it except to say, well, it kind of looks like the thing that came before. And I haven't given you any real reason for thinking that the thing that came before was any good. But this is one of those cases where I just want to say, I want this to be justified by its sort of fruits rather than this being immediately obviously the right thing to do. Because once again, we get exactly the same shape of theorems as we had in the case of the ordinary story. So the first theorem we have is that Boolean stage theory, the thing which had 6 axioms and all the primitives and was obviously true but clunky, is basically exactly the same theory as the Boolean level theory, the theory which was given in one primitive but was kind of incomprehensible. They're the same theory in this sense. They tell you exactly the same things if you just restrict your way of speaking to speaking about sets. So if you just stop talking about stages, they come to exactly the same theory. And that's good because Boolean stage theory is obviously true of anything which obeys the complemented story. That is, you might say it's obviously true of any complemented hierarchy. Boolean level theory makes exactly the same claims about sets, so it's also true of any complemented hierarchy, even if it's no longer obvious and you needed to do a bit of theorem proving. You need to prove theorem 2.1. The next result, again, is exactly analogous to the case of level theory. So in Boolean level theory, the bevels are well ordered by membership. We also have a quasi-categoricity result, as we did for level theory. It's clunky to state exactly what it is. I can tell you more about it if you want. And then a couple of results which are idiosyncratic about this. So the first is that the sets form a Boolean algebra. So intersection is, well, what you'd expect it to be, and complementation is involution. That's what they call it in a Boolean algebra. So that's kind of nice. Also kind of nice is this inverting result. So there is a contra-automorphism. I don't think there's an actual name for this sort of map in the literature. But there is a map which is a permutation on the universe, and it has this feature that A is a member of B just in case the image of A is not a member of the image of B. So there's a way in which you could sort of see this result as saying you don't necessarily know which way up you're looking at the hierarchy. You can sort of switch it round and have the empty set occupying the place of the universal set and everything. Is that Owain? Not sure how to pronounce your name, but yeah, you've asked a thing. Do you want to?
Yeah, no problem. Sorry, just a very quick technical question. I'm wondering, when you're giving these quasi-categoricity results, does this turn on any presupposition about the height of the hierarchy? Because, for instance, Zermelo's original quasi-categoricity result presupposes an inaccessible cardinal, and I'm wondering if there's similar kind of things in the background here for these conceptions.
So no, good question, but no. So if we go back to the level theory one, just very quickly, explicitly you've lost any cardinality considerations. We say any ordinal height will do. So we don't need to talk about inaccessibility. And in a way, that's why this thing is nice. And also what you just said about presupposing an inaccessible, that's what comes out in the fact below. It's you've added enough axioms to tell me something that says, oh, we're pruning down those alphas. Now alpha needs to be an inaccessible. Basically, the same stuff holds for Boolean level theory as well. It can be as high as you like, and all you need to do is tell me the height of the hierarchy, and I then know everything I need to know. The one difference between these sorts of results is that they don't embed. If you think about the way that things work in the case of ZF, your familiar setting, you know that given any two hierarchies, one is an initial segment of the other, maybe not a proper initial segment, they might be perfectly isomorphic, but one slots nicely into the other. It's not immediately obvious that you want to say that here, because if you've got two different Boolean hierarchies and one is taller than the other, there's a straightforward set to which you want to say, well, the universal set in one contains more stuff than the other, so it's not actually found in the other one. So you have to be a little bit clever about the way you state quasi-categoricity. But it remains the case that any ordinal can be used to specify the height of a hierarchy. So there are no assumptions like that floating around in answer to your question. And once you've specified that ordinal, you tell me everything you need to know. It pins down the model up to the fact that you don't know whether the empty set is a piece of fruit or Julius Caesar or whatever.
Oh, thank you. Sorry for interrupting.
No, it's a good question. Okay, so we've got this theory which is in many ways like level theory, but it's got these weird, fun idiosyncrasies, like the sets now form a Boolean algebra. It's got this cool contra-automorphism. I like all of that stuff. But how do the two theories relate to one another? Well, obviously, in some sense, they immediately and strongly disagree with one another, right? Like one says there is a universal set, and the other says there isn't. One says that the axiom of separation holds unrestrictedly, and the other one doesn't, because the moment you have a universal set, you can't have separation, or you immediately get the Russell set. In fact, almost none of the standard axioms of ZF set theory hold in this Boolean level theoretic setting. And that's not because we haven't made the hierarchy go on high enough. It's because they fail in a catastrophic way. So power sets catastrophically fails. If you add power sets and you say, well, maybe power sets is okay if you have just one stage, but if you have more than one stage, then power sets is also inconsistent. So basically, everything breaks down. They seem to disagree with one another radically. And that might force us to choose between the ordinary story and the complemented story. I'll come back to whether we really need to make that choice a little bit later. But for now, I just want to give you a result which unifies these two theories. So this is a synonymy result. Can I check, how many of you encountered the notion of synonymy in this kind of context before? Not the kind of Quine writing Two Dogmas of Empiricism criticizing synonymy, but in the context of model theory or proof theory? There's a single nod that I can see. Okay, so I will spend just a little bit of time explaining it. I'll offer well, this is the formal definition here, but I'll also try and offer an informal gloss. So the theories that we're going to show are synonymous are slight extensions of the two theories I've given you so far. So a theory called LT plus, which takes the original theory of LT and adds the axiom, there's no last level. So the hierarchy doesn't run out of puff. It doesn't just stop at like level 6 and say, well, we're done there. And a similar extension of Boolean level theory. Now, in framing this, I've said the theories we're going to show are synonymous. And synonymy is a formally defined relationship between axiomatic formal theories. And in a way, it's what you might call the tightest relationship that theories can have to one another, short of just being the very same theory. So it may not have ever occurred to you, but when we do things like talk about isomorphism between theories, if we're careful, we have to be very strict. And we have to say that an isomorphism is a function which is a map between the domains of two models, which has the following effect that you have a transformation from the interpretation of symbol in the signature of one model over to the other. And you want the two models to have exactly the same signature. So that's just built into the very idea of isomorphism as it's standardly defined, that you actually say L structures are isomorphic just in case, and you build in the relativity to L, the signature of the structure there. But that's often a very coarse-grained notion of a relationship between models. So just to take a very simple example, consider the theory of piano arithmetic as it's standardly axiomatized, and then consider the theory which is basically the same, but it just deletes the constant symbol 0. So you don't have that as a symbol anymore. You don't really lose anything by getting rid of that constant, because you could always just say there is some number which is not the successor of any other number, or indeed of any number, not its own successor either. And that will uniquely pick out 0. So you don't need the constant, it's eliminable. But you can't say that two models, one of the theory of ordinary piano arithmetic and the other of the theory which doesn't have that constant symbol, you can't now say that they're isomorphic anymore, even if by all like good standards they look alike, because you explicitly define the notion of isomorphism to build in the idea that the models share the same signature. So what you want to do is say something like, well, can we be a bit more relaxed? I mean, what's happened here is the fact that we could define 0 without loss using stuff on the one side. So surely we can offer some sort of notion like that, which enables us to get around the fact that, strictly speaking, these things can't be isomorphic. It doesn't make sense to say they're isomorphic, but come on. That's what the notion of synonymy or definitional equivalence is designed to do. It's designed to say that you can offer definitions on one side, which once you've added them, enable you to have isomorphism. Well, you want to be able to add definitions on both sides. Now, I've been talking about models there, but my interest is actually more in theories, because when I lay down a theory, I lay down a class of models. I don't necessarily know exactly which model I have in mind. And that's very important for the results that I've been giving you. For example, the quasi-categoricity result explicitly tells me that my theory doesn't pin down a unique model. Rather, it says, you know, any stage of the hierarchy will do, but there's a ton of different things. So what I need is basically this notion of saying these theories are notational variants of one another. They are saying the same thing in different packaging or something like that. And that's where the notion of synonymy comes in as a formal notion. So that was all just a spiel of me attempting to motivate the idea. Okay, so here's the formal idea of what synonymy is. So the first thing is that we've got two theories and we have interpretations between them. Here I've called them I and J. And an interpretation is a way of recursively translating the symbols of one theory over to the symbols of the other. And it preserves theoremhood. So the slogan for an interpretation is that translations of theorems are theorems. So for I to be an interpretation from LT plus to BLT plus is to say that we've got a way of redefining the membership symbol that LT is using, such that under that redefinition, anything that LT plus proved is now proved within BLT plus. And then we've also got an interpretation going exactly the other way. So I takes you from LT plus to BLT plus, and J takes you back in the opposite direction. So you've got interpretations going in both directions. But we also, and this is what makes it synonymy, have the fact that if you compose the two interpretations in either order, you get back exactly where you started. So the next two lines on the slide tell you precisely how to gloss that. But the intuitive way I think about this is if you use something like Google Translate and you type in something in English, which is a language I speak, and I'm translating it into a language I very much don't speak. So I get back the string of symbols and I don't really know whether the task has been successful. And a very good check as to whether or not it has been successful is to copy and paste that back in and ask Google to reverse translate it. And if you get back to something which has the same meaning in English as what you started with, it's a pretty good bet that the translation was okay. But this doesn't always work, right? Sometimes you introduce an odd ambiguity via the translation, and you bounce back and forth and you go, oh, wow, that ambiguity spiraled out of all control. It's basically that for formal theories. Okay, so what this tells me is that I can regard these two theories as offering notationally different ways to express all the same stuff. So there's a way of suggesting that we don't really need to choose between these theories. Rather, they are just, at least from a formal perspective, they contain exactly the same sort of deductive content. Because after all, any now proof that I offer on one side, I can interpret over to a proof in the other. And if I interpret that back, I get a proof that was basically the original proof. So this is all a way of saying these theories, which seem to radically disagree with one another, actually have a way in which they can be said to be just different perspectives on the same kind of thing. Okay, and everything I've just said about LT plus and this theory BLT plus, because it holds for these very weak theories, holds also for more, for strengthened versions. So if you asked me, could we do this stuff for ZF, which is our preferred theory or whatever, then I say, yeah, I can just give you an appropriate extension. Basically, as ZF arises from LT just by saying, let's make the hierarchy pretty big. So I add a similar principle to BLT that makes that hierarchy pretty big, and I get this synonymy result holding. So this synonymy result is really robust, which is nice. Okay, so that is my first illustration of a really different story that apparently leads back to the same place. I'm now going to give you another story. I'm not going to give it in as much detail. And then I'm going to get really slapdash and give you a template for generating new stories. And then I'm going to speculate wildly to wrap things up. Okay, so here's the next story. It's pretty different. The way in which it's different is that we're not even going to talk about sets anymore. We're going to talk about functions. So instead of saying sets are arranged in stages, the very first sentence of the story has changed. We now say functions are arranged in stages, but functions are the primitive entity in this new story. But just as sets in our previous stories, functions are arranged in stages and every function is found at some stage. And then we say at any stage S, you find all those functions whose domains and ranges are exhausted by the functions that we found earlier. We find nothing else at stage S. So this is very much like a cumulative iterative notion of set, but it's just the cumulative iterative notion of, well, partial function. Why don't we use this theory? Why do we use the set theory version? I've no idea. I've no idea whether it's just a historical accident. I mean, it sure seems like this theory is as coherent as the previous theory. But, let's run with it. Let's see where it takes us. Similar comments as before, very minimal. I don't tell you anything about the length of the stages, etc., etc. But by this, by this part of the talk, you hopefully can see where this is going to be going. Okay, so there are some questions we need to take about exactly how to formalize this. I'm just going to do it in a fairly naive way. So because I'm talking about functions, I'll write them in the standard way. Probably if I were going to do this strictly, I'd want to have some primitive predicate or primitive operator or something which stood for functional application, but I'm just going to omit that for ease. And I could do that thing which I did in the previous cases where I ran you through a stage theoretic version, and I gave you lots and lots of primitives, and I gave you two sorts, one for primitive functions, another for primitive stages. But I'm just going to skip all that because it ceases to be illuminating, and trust me, you can, in the end, do that and then get to where we want to. So I'm just going to get us where we want to, which is, here's the axiomatic theory, functional level theory, which is basically sound and complete for the story that I just told you. So it's got a principle of sort of functional extensionality, which tells you that functions are identical just in case whenever they, well, what's the right way of reading that? They have exactly the same actions on all the same inputs. So this approximately equal thing, fx approximately equal to gx, is that if either fx is defined or gx is defined, then fx is equal to gx. So this principle says f and g are equal just in case they behave exactly the same for given inputs. i.e. they might both spit out an input and say, I don't know what to do with that, I'm only a partial function, I can't handle that one. That's okay. They might, if they act on it at all, then they both map it to the same thing. That's a pretty good principle for identity of partial functions. Then we have a principle which is kind of like separation, which is, how to read this? Okay, so if there is a function A such that for any second order map P, anything in the domain and in the range of P is in the domain or the range of A, then indeed there is a function which behaves in the first order sense, which behaves exactly like the second order map P. So it's like a separation principle. It sort of brings you down from second order entities to first order entities, provided that all the stuff that they were doing was basically well defined on stuff that we've already found. And then a final principle, which is very much like the sort of principle of stratification that we've had earlier, which is that for any function A, there is a functional level such that anything which is either in the domain or the range of that function is in the domain or the range of that functional level. So I've been using this sort of quasi-membership sign, which I've done with a Greek letter epsilon, and I should probably have pointed out that that's defined a little bit lower down on the slides, to say that X is a member of F is to say that either F is defined on input X, so X is in the domain of F, or X is a value of F. So it's basically what it's saying, X is either in the domain or the range of F. Okay, probably should have said that earlier. Anyway, these are the axioms, and it turns out that this is sound and complete of the story that I told earlier, and you can show that by doing a similar kind of argument where you write down the stage theory first, then you write down these axioms, and then you prove a theorem showing that they're equivalent. And then you can also show that level theory plus, i.e. level theory when you add the axiom that there's no last level, is synonymous to functional level theory plus, i.e. this theory plus the axiom that there's no last functional level. So once again, it looks like we've got a very different way of thinking about things. You know, it's not that these theories conflict this time around. Last time we had sets and their complements, and that looked like we were really disagreeing. But now what we've got is one story about sets, and then another story about totally different entities, functions. But we've got this synonymy result telling us that they can be viewed as just notationally different ways to get at the same subject matter. Okay, that was a third story. Now I'm going to give you a template. So a little bit of autobiography at this stage. Once I proved the theorem for functions, I was just like, there's got to be a meta theorem here. There's got to be like something which enables me to just like start grinding the handle and make all of these results fall out, because they're feeling kind of repetitive. And so I was thinking a bit about that. And I was also thinking a bit about, I'd had some conversations with Thomas Forster, who I mentioned earlier, who is quite a fan of John Conway's book on numbers and games. And motivated by that, I tried to come up with a very general way of thinking about all this stuff. So what I'm after is a general way of telling stories, which has this kind of cumulative iterative feature about it. And moreover, once you tell that story, you know that you're going to end up with something which is synonymous with an appropriate version of level theory. So that's what I'm going to do in this section. Here's the template story. Objects, we may be thinking about sets, we may be thinking about functions, we may be thinking about some mathematical beast that you've never yet heard of, are found in stages. For every stage, and then there are two conditions here. For anything found before that stage, you find at that stage the bland set whose members are exactly those things. So I'm using this phrase bland set, and basically I just want you to think about this in the way that we were thinking about ordinary sets. And this is exactly the clause that we had for ordinary sets. So you have these entities called bland sets, and they're just sort of handy little helper things that float around for you. And then you also have this further condition, which is that for any object A, which you found earlier, and for any magic wand W, you find at that stage the result of tapping the object with the magic wand, provided that that actually yields something. And you don't find anything else. So this is a very general template. Part of it is familiar, the bland sets are familiar, the magic wands, those are new. But hopefully you can see how it might link, for example, to the complemented story already, because think about the intuition as I described it earlier. I said, for any set you find its complement, well, we could instead just say, I'm going to give you a magic wand called Complementizer, and you can just run around hitting things with Complementizer. Whenever you form them, you can go bang, 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 and then you form things and you hit them like that. So obviously, if you describe things right, so you replace the word objects here with sets, and then you've got bland sets, which are the low sets, and you've got a magic wand, which is the complementizer, you end up with something which is going to look exactly like the complemented story. So this is clearly generalizing some of the stuff we've done already, but it actually generalizes it a hell of a lot. So here's the meta theorem. I have to state things loosely at this stage because it gets technical fast. The meta theorem is this. So if your wands are hereditarily bland, by which I mean they are themselves bland sets, whose members are bland sets, whose members are bland sets, and so on all the way down. And also the wands themselves form a set, so there's not too many wands, otherwise things get out of control. So that's the first condition. And if also the wands have a loosely constructive action, I can't really tell you what that means in the time I have available, but it's something a bit like the kind of action that we're allowed in ZF set theory when we say, it's a bit predicative because we know that it's arranged nicely ordinal-wise, but it's definitely not predicative in the sense that predicative mathematics likes, because, you're allowed to form, power sets in a way which feels impredicative and people get upset by. So it's loosely constructive. And if also your hierarchy isn't stupidly short, and again, I can't tell you exactly what that means, but it's a very weak condition. If those three conditions hold for the story as you told it, using the story template on the previous slide, then the formal theory that you get out from it is synonymous with a slightly tweaked version of level theory. And the way in which you do the tweak is very, very simple. So there's like a mechanical way of generating the boring story about sets, which will be synonymous with this wild and crazy story that has whatever magic wands you wanted flying around. Okay, so this is super, super abstract. So I'm just going to quickly give you a few more illustrations of how you might apply it. Obviously, the basic story is an instance of this. You just don't have any magic wands. I've already told you how the complemented story is an instance of this. You just have a single wand, complementizer. The functional story, as I told it earlier, is a version of this. If you have a wand which applied to sets that kind of look like functions in the way you're familiar with thinking about sets as implementing functions, gives you a new sui generis object, which we're going to call function objects. And actually then you can get rid of the bland sets and say those are a very special kind of these functions. I'm not going to go into detail about how to do that, but you can force that story into this mold. And here are some more examples if you wanted any more. So I'm just going to talk about the first of these and just leave the others up as possible things that people might be interested in. So I said this is inspired by Conway's On Numbers and Games. It's particularly inspired by a moment in the appendix to part 0 of the book, which occurs around page 66, so roughly halfway through. And he's been talking about this theory of games. And the basic idea of a Conway game is just one of the most beautiful ideas in like sort of soft mathematics there is. So Conway's insight is a two-player game is something which you can describe as it's got left options for the player that we'll call left and right options for the player that we call right. So those options are just like moves that the left player and the right player might make. And then a game is just a hereditary game, which is to say every option is itself a game. and every option within every game is itself a game, and so on all the way down. Why is that the case? Well, think about chess. That's a two-player game that we're all very familiar with. You can consider chess, but you can also consider a game which is very much like chess, but slightly different. You have to start with the opening moves as if they were the first two moves of the Sicilian defense. So as if white had played e4 and black had played c5. Now, that's another game, right? It's a very slight variant of a game. But the moment we think about it like that, we say, oh, a move in a game is just a map from a game to another game. So games are hereditary games. And now Conway can offer a completely general theory of games using this insight. So this is kind of cool. And he has a notion of what it is to be identical across games. And we can do all of this using the story template that I told earlier. We can actually do all of the other things that Conway wants to do with his games using these templates too. So he introduces things that you may have heard of, like the surreal numbers, via taking quotients over Conway games. And we can just ensure that our magic wands have that quotienting action. So that's actually a pretty typical way that the wands act. They take various inputs and they collapse them down to the same thing. They act as quotientizers. So everything that Conway wants to do, we can slip within this formalism, which is precisely what Conway said surely would be able to do this, but I can't be bothered to write it down because I'm not that kind of guy. And haven't we moved beyond the stage where we bother writing down formal theories? Ugh, I despair. Anyway, now on to part one. I got stuck at that little bit in between. Okay, I've got a few other examples of things you can do if you want with this template for generating stories, but I'm not going to run through them. I mean, at this point, the general gist is, you know, the world is your oyster. You can do infinitely many different things. You just need to choose sensible wands, and away you go. You'll end up with something which is interesting, perhaps. Maybe there are some cool mathematical properties of it, just like there are with Conway games and surreal numbers. But also, you know that in the end, it's going to be synonymous with a very boring, familiar story about sets. Okay, so there's lots of things that might happen at this stage. There's lots of questions that one might have. I'm just going to ask a sort of metaphysical question, because maybe that's just autobiography on my part. Like I got into various questions in philosophy of mathematics and logic via first being interested in things from the point of view of metaphysics, and I guess I'm maybe just stuck with that curse. So now I just want to come back to some of those metaphysical questions to end. Okay, so here's a question that you might ask if you're Ted Sider. I'll call it the banquet question, because it's a question about trying to carve things, bits of meat, I don't know, at their joints. And I say you might ask this if you're Ted Sider, because if you're familiar with the way that Ted Sider tends to work, he says that, you know, the world has a fundamental structure. What we're trying to do is carve nature at the joints in a kind of pretty, you know, structurally realist way. So I've got all these different stories that I've given you. You might now, Ted Sider style, ask the question, which of these stories carves Platonic heaven at the joints? Which of them really gets at the way mathematical reality is? Now, you can give various different ways of trying to approach this. I mean, you might well want to just dismiss the question as bogus, and in the end, I do want to do that. But in order to do that, I need to address some of the other things you might do first. So there's a partisan sort of way of answering this, which is you say, okay, I've got all of these stories. I guess I have to choose one of them as being the right way of carving Platonic heaven at the joints. The difficulty with that is that it really does seem like any particular story, it would just be a miracle if that were the right story rather than one of the others. I mean, it just seems wholly arbitrary to say, really, Platonic heaven consists of sets rather than functions, or vice versa. There's just nothing, I think, that anyone can say that would make it plausible that sets are more like natural joints in mathematics than functions. I choose that as a particularly good instance, I think, because some of these stories are going to end up just like really wild, and it's like, why would anyone want to use that story? Maybe you can infer from something about the elegance and simplicity of the story or something like that, that it's a bad story. And nature likes things to be simple. I don't really know why metaphysicians argue that way. I don't really know why you'd think that nature likes things to be simple. I kind of have the vibe that nature likes things to be complicated and baroque and very difficult to understand. But even if you do think that nature likes things to be nice and simple and intelligible, and that you don't think that's just a sort of residue of a theological aspiration that may have made sense in a certain era of metaphysics but doesn't any longer, still, there's nothing to tell between the function story and the ordinary story. I mean, they're both really good. So partisan answers seem pretty bad. I mean, you could go like epistemicist and say, well, there is a correct answer, but we don't know which it is. But that also just seems really rubbish. So that leads to an alternative, which is an ecumenical answer. You say something like, well, look, tons of different stories are good, and in fact, they're all joint carving. So up there in Platonic heaven, there are set-like joints, but there are also function joints, and there's bunches of other ways of carving the joints. And the reason people don't like that is it's profligate about nature's joints. So one of the things that Sider says early on in writing the Book of the World, when he talks about all this stuff to do with joints, is that you don't want to posit too much structure. If you start positing too much structure, that's a really bad thing. Again, not sure exactly why people would have that principle. But assuming they do, then they're not going to be very happy with this ecumenical answer, because it's going to mean that nature, in this case, Platonic heaven, has just joints all over the shop, and you can sort of carve wherever you like, and you'll end up hitting a joint. So here's an alternative. I mean, one thing you might do at this stage is say, look, all of this stuff about joints of nature is rubbish. All of the stuff about fundamental metaphysics is rubbish. We should just stop doing metaphysics. And whilst I confess that a part of me is tempted towards that, I think there's a halfway house, which is instead to say, let's not give up immediately on doing metaphysics, but let's give up on this idea of joint carving. So we'll give up on this banquet question. We'll stop asking which story carves heaven's joints, but we're still going to try and do something recognizable as metaphysics. So what might that look like? Well, my suggestion is we can think about fundamental metaphysics, at least within philosophy of mathematics, along the following lines. We've got these equivalence results, and what they show us is that there are certain deep equivalences between the various stories that we told. And moreover, we can isolate something like a shared content that all of these stories have in common. I mean, not just any theory is synonymous with the ones that we're offering. They really have to have a certain kind of tractable shape to them. It's something about their ability to be described in this iterative way, to have things going in a cumulative iterative process that allows us to prove these synonymy results. And that shared content is what's really important in the fundamental metaphysics of philosophy of mathematics. So I want to say, you shouldn't think that the fundamental facts are particularly articulated as all and only the truths of, say, ZF or the axioms of ZF or something like that. It's rather what you get at by looking at what is shared between all of these different theories. So that's a much baggier notion. It's much weaker. Some of the things that you end up with from any particular story turn out as artifacts. So I guess there is just one final question, which is there a way of describing a formal theory which doesn't have any representational artifacts here, which doesn't have anything in it which is sort of an arbitrary choice? Like all of these different stories that we tell, we make an arbitrary choice at the outset. We might say, I'm going to talk about sets and they behave like this. I'm going to talk about functions and they behave like this. And we say, well, it was arbitrary to talk about sets. It was arbitrary to talk about functions. Can you tell a story? Can you lay down a theory which doesn't have any amount of arbitrariness built into it? I doubt that there is a way of doing that. At one point, I thought I had a way of proving that there is no way of doing this. Can't remember why I thought that. I'm still confident that there is such a theory, so hopefully I'll remember it once I've given this talk. But I'm very doubtful that it's possible to provide a simple neutral theory which has no representational artifacts, but presents exactly the content that we're trying to get at. So my suggestion is, you can think of it roughly like this. You're you want to do geometry and you don't know of any way to do geometry in an adequate fashion that doesn't involve, say, assigning to every point a coordinate. But you know that you could have used a different coordinate system and that would have been okay. So any time you write stuff down, you're aware that your representation of what's going on is a bit arbitrary because you've chosen a particular coordinate system and you could have chosen other coordinate systems. And you just have to bear that in mind and remember which bits are really telling you what's going on and which bits are mere representational artifacts. So similarly here, I want to say we've got all of these different stories, and all of them are different good ways of having a viewpoint on the cumulative hierarchy, which is, I think, something that we might really care about, something which has a deep, perhaps metaphysically fundamental sort of structure to it. But it would be a mere artifact of representation to insist on describing it as a cumulative hierarchy of sets rather than a cumulative hierarchy of functions or a cumulative hierarchy of Conway games or any of the other various options that I gave you. So to find out what is genuinely fundamental, you have to work in a theory, but you remember that you could have worked in one of several theories, and then you just think about what is shared across these theories in order to figure out what's really going on and what really matters. So that's my proposal for how to do the metaphysics of mathematics, at least the metaphysics of the cumulative hierarchy. And I think I have run out of time, so I'll stop there. Thanks very much.